Greetings everyone, we're back again to do a very important topic, paper number 19, titled Christ's Age at Baptism and the Duration of His Ministry. The year of Christ's birth has been and has caused a great deal of concern over time. It seems to have been deliberately hidden. This is probably so we could not ascertain with absolute certainty the exact year to avoid the celebration of pagan ritual associated with his birth. There are, however, a number of important facts that are linked to his birth and time of baptism. Wade, would you like to expand on this very important topic?
Yes, it is an important topic, and the reason paper number 19, Christ's Age at Baptism and the Duration of His Ministry, was recorded, was because the churches of God started to play around with numbers and establishing claims that Christ was born in the year 4 BC at the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, it is the understanding of the church over 2,000 years that Christ was born around Tabernacles, but the year was never specified, and the text Brady's Clavis Calendaria was written in the early 1800s, and that stated that Christ was born around Tabernacles of no specific year. So what happened was that when the churches of God started claiming that Christ was born around at 4 BC at Tabernacles as a specific date, it was based on the claim that Christ began to be about 30 when he began to commence his ministry. Now, the problem is, once you make these grandiose statements, the problem with the churches of God was their ministry were not educated enough in either logic or history to know the consequences of what they were saying. Now, if you claim that Christ was born in the year 4 BC, then you've got a problem. Because if he was born in the year 4 BC at the Feast of Tabernacles, you have to take your Bible and tear out the book of Luke, you have to tear out the book of Matthew and throw them away. Because what you're saying is that those books aren't correct. What you're saying is that Christ was born after the death of Herod, and therefore the Gospels can't be correct in what they're saying about Herod being alive when Christ was born. Now, the reality is that Herod died between the 1st and the 13th of Abib in the year 4 BC. And we know that after there was an eclipse of the moon in the year 5 BC and in the year 4 BC. And the eclipse of the moon in 4 BC occurred on the 13th of Abib, 4 BC, and Herod was dead before that eclipse of the moon. Therefore, Christ had to have been born over 40 days before the eclipse of the moon on the 13th of Abib, 4 BC. So Christ could not have been born any later than January, at the very latest, January 4 BC. But the saying was, the tradition of the church was that Christ was born around the Feast of Tabernacles before the death of Herod. Now, he could have been born around the Feast of Tabernacles 18 months before the death of Herod. We don't know. We do know, in concerning the censuses of Augustus, we know that there were a sequence of censuses, but there was no census in 4 BC or 5 BC. There was no census until 2 AD. But there were censuses in 12 BC, and there were censuses around to 6 BC. And so it's possible that Christ was born around 6 BC, because there are a series of censuses done, but it wasn't the general census declared by Augustus around the year 12 BC. All of that is covered in the paper on the Christ Age Baptism, paper 19. We've covered all of the works of the years when the censuses were organised. Much also depends on when they talk about the census of Quirinius. We know that Quirinius was working against the Homenidenzes, which were a band of brigands in the north. That is not Israel, in the north of Syria. And these brigands were the subject or the object of Roman reactions to try and stop their brigandry. And that had a significance. The paper discusses all of that, and the timings of the possible censuses and the timings of the birth of Christ. What we are sure of, biblically and historically, is that Christ was born before the year 4 BC. And anyone who says that he was born in the year 4 BC at the Feast of Tabernacles has no idea of what he is talking about, or they are talking about. It is an historical and biblical impossibility for Christ to have been born in 4 BC at Tabernacles. These are important subjects to understand, and it also deals with Christ's movement into Egypt with his parents, and it was the reason that Christ, when he went to Egypt, went to an established community with a temple which had been ordered to be built by God through the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 19:19. Now that was ordered by Isaiah in the 7th century BC, but it didn't happen until Onias IV went there in the 2nd century BCE and ordered the construction of the temple there in Egypt at Heliopolis, the city of the sun. Now, all of these are important historical aspects to note what Christ was doing, when he was doing it, and where it was being done. These things are significant, and we know therefore that from 4 BC, 5 BC, we know if he's born in 5 BC at the latest, then in the year 27 CE, which we know accurately was the time John the Baptist began his ministry, and we know that Christ was baptized in 27 CE by John the Baptist, and we know that he declared the acceptable year of the Lord, which is the Day of Atonement and the Jubilee at Atonement of 27 CE. So we know that he was baptized and active in 27, but he had not begun his ministry. We know that he began his ministry in 28 CE after the Passover, because after the Passover of 28 CE, John the Baptist's disciples and Christ and his disciples were baptizing at Aenon near Salim on the Jordan. That's given to us from the Gospels, from Matthew and John. Now, we know that Christ had not begun his ministry until John the Baptist was put in prison at that time. So, from 27 through to 5 BC means that Christ had to be 32 years of age when he was baptized. He may have been 33, or he may have been older. The Bible is not specific. He began to be about 30. The Greek term means he began to be in his 30s. It is a generic term that we use when we say, oh, he's in his 30s. That doesn't pinpoint anything. It means that he's in his 30s. He could be 31 or he could be 39. It could be 30 or he could be 39. But he's not 40. That's all that text means. That's important. And the churches didn't understand the logic of what they were saying. And when you talk about 4 BC, you're throwing away 2 Gospels. So it's important that you get these things right. It's important that you understand that everything you say, you believe. Everything you teach somebody else has got to be true. And it's got to be demonstrable, historically and through logic. You can't make silly statements that are illogical and historically incorrect and expect people have any respect for you, to give you respect, and certainly not to believe and adopt your faith. There's no reason why they should do so. In fact, they would be silly if they did.
And Wade, I was going to say, in this paper also, it talks about the duration of his actual ministry, doesn't it? And there's a lot of confusion out there about that issue, isn't there?
Yes. So we know that he began his ministry in 28 CE after the Passover. Now, we'll talk about this when we deal with the sign of Jonah and the history of the reconstruction of the temple as well. But this is important. We know that he only operated through another 2 years. In the year 30 CE, he was executed. He wasn't executed in 31 CE because it's physically impossible for him to be executed in 31 CE in accordance with the temple calendar. In 30 CE, the 14th of Abib fell on the 5th of April. That is, it fell on a Wednesday. So Wednesday, 5th of April, 30 CE, is the time he was executed. Because he was executed on a Wednesday. And the day after he was executed was a holy day. And that was 2 days before the Sabbath. And that was 3 days over the period of the first holy day of unleavened bread, the Friday, and the Sabbath. He was resurrected at evening on the Sabbath, April 30 CE, and he waited overnight till the Sunday morning at 9 a.m. when the wave sheep was traditionally waved in the temple. And he went before the throne of God at that Sunday morning at 9 a.m. when the wave sheep was presented, waved before God. There is a forgery which we'll deal with in the book of Daniel in the King James Version. The King James Version is a Trinitarian rag full of forgeries which are aimed at altering the understanding of the history of the church and the creation of mankind, implying that Christ created all of the structure of the heavens and the earth, which he did not. We'll deal with those things on other papers. But the reality is that in this system of the development of Christ under the sign of Jonah, he was a day's journey, as Jonah was, into Nineveh and into the church, establishing the nucleus of the church. As Jonah travelled the day's journey into Nineveh, Christ established the church and established his work under John the Baptist. Then, from 28, 29 and 30, Christ began his ministry and was executed at the Passover of 30 CE. Now, 28 CE fell on a Sunday, 29 CE fell on the Saturday, 30 CE fell on a Wednesday, 31 CE fell on a Saturday, 32 CE fell on a Sunday, and 33 CE fell on a Thursday. Only one day in that week of years could Christ have complied with the sign of Jonah, and it was not 31 CE. And it doesn't matter what fabrications you create from the forgeries in the King James Version in Daniel 9:25, you're still a heretic. The death of Christ was in 30 CE on Wednesday the 5th of April. Now, get that straight. Make sure you don't make errors in that regard. Christ's ministry, as we know from John, covered 3 Passovers. It didn't cover 4 Passovers. And the reference to a 4th Passover by some of these churches of God is a reference to the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks, not to any Passover. So get your facts right. It's important. This paper is important for you to understand and stop you making stupid claims about the date of the death of Christ. It's the most significant thing we've got, and it fits within the sign of Jonah, as well as establishing the period involved, and the date of his birth is important in establishing the veracity of the timings and the structure all those years ago. You have to know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and like you say, Wade, I mean, the data is there. There's historical fact as well as biblical scripture to prove it. Why they still go on and try and speculate these other dates, I don't know. I mean, as you say, they just do not want to face the truth of it because it brings them undone.
No, yeah.
So look, paper number 19 is the one to go looking for. Christ's age at baptism and the duration of his ministry.